Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Voilà, je vous laisse vous installer, les derniers arrivants. Je vous remercie infiniment de votre présence à cette conférence de rentrée du domaine d'études Concevoir et construire l'architecture. Donc, je suis Pierre Chabard, enseignant d'histoire et de théorie dans cette école, responsable des éditions de La Villette et coordinateur avec mon collègue Carlo Crispello de ce domaine d'études Concevoir et construire l'architecture. Donc, j'animerai cette soirée avec mon collègue Brent Patterson à ma gauche, qui me prêtera main forte par sa connaissance de la théorie architecturale contemporaine et par sa maîtrise de l'anglais aussi. Brent, si tu veux dire un mot.
Hi, so my name is Brent Patterson. I teach here and also at Malachi in theory, as it was mentioned, and I also have a seminar with Manola Antonioli on political ecology. Sorry, I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to be squeaking in English this evening.
Thank you, Brent. Donc cette soirée est un moment exceptionnel à plusieurs titres. D'abord, elle interrompt une longue et incompréhensible absence sur la scène française d'une figure incontournable de la théorie architecturale, Jeremy Till, que je remercie infiniment de sa présence à Paris. Jeremy Till est architecte, même s'il se dit en voie de guérison, c'est dans sa biographie. Il est une figure majeure de l'enseignement et de la recherche en architecture. Il a enseigné dans plusieurs établissements importants, en Grande-Bretagne, Kingston Polytechnic, la Bartlett School of Architecture, l'université de Sheffield. Il a aussi dirigé la Central St. Martin's et fut vice-chancelier de l'University of the Art London. Il a assuré aussi le commissariat de plusieurs pavillons britanniques dans des biennales internationales, celle de Venise en 2006, celle de Shenzhen en 2013. Mais il a surtout, évidemment, marqué le champ de la théorie architecturale par ses nombreux écrits. Et c'est à ce titre également que cette soirée est exceptionnelle, parce qu'elle marque la sortie en français de son grand livre « Ça dépend ». Et c'est sur les contingences de l'architecture, donc le titre anglais c'était Architecture Depends, qui sort ce mois-ci aux éditions de La Villette. Alors pourquoi traduire ce titre-là ? Évidemment, Jeremy Till a publié bien d'autres livres sur des sujets aussi importants que l'architecture du quotidien en 1998, sur la participation, en 2005, sur la flexibilité dans l'architecture domestique, en 2007, sur l'agentivité spatiale, Spatial Agency, en 2009, ou sur l'exercice de l'architecture dans une conjoncture de raréfaction des ressources en 2014. Ces ouvrages, il les a coécrits, souvent avec d'autres auteurs, notamment Sarah Wigglesworth, Peter Bluden-Jones, Doina Petrescu, Nishat Awan, Tatiana Schneider ou John Goodburn. Mais Architecture Depends, publié au MIT Press en 2009, est le seul écrit de sa main et peut être vu comme le plus programmatique de sa pensée, une pensée qui interroge depuis plusieurs décennies les conditions de possibilité d'une architecture qui réponde aux questions, petites et grandes, que lui adresse la société. Une architecture qui fasse de ses contingences externes non pas des obstacles à sa pureté, mais des véritables opportunités de transformation. Une architecture qui puise dans ses contingences les clés pour espérer avoir une quelconque utilité, une quelconque agentivité sur le réel. So, in this regard, it makes great sense to me and to all of us to welcome you, Jeremy Till, in this school, where, since its foundations, the humanities and social sciences were placed at the heart of architectural education. One indication to the many ties that bring us together is the example you give on the page 70 of the book to illustrate the contingency of architecture. Le Corbusier Spessac. and the many transformations by the people who lived there. You visited Pessac in the 80s, and you observed that, I quote, the inhabitants' irrepressible do-it-yourself tendencies led to an inevitability that the purity of the original would be overwhelmed by the urge of everyday life. On this subject, you mention, of course, Philippe Boudon and his famous Études socio-architecturales on Pessac, with a preface by Henri Lefebvre. As you may know, Philippe Boudon was a very important teacher and researcher in this school. And in this place where his voice once resounded, I'm delighted to give you the floor, Jeremy Till, with many, many thanks once again for your presence in Paris tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. And thank you to Pierre and the Edition Villette for a labor of love, I think. It is not, and Jean-Francois, who translated it, it's not an easy book to translate because I have a very, I think it says on the cover, very English sense of humor. I'm not sure what that means, but maybe you will know in an hour's time. So I think it is quite a difficult book to translate, and I am delighted that it is now translated into French, over 20 years after I wrote it, and I did an epilogue in it, which maybe I will talk about. So the first thing to note is Pierre said to me, we don't like the title. Architecture depends. I said, just translate it directly. Architecture dépend. What's the problem, yeah? And he said, no, it doesn't work. And I thought, I can't actually argue because the book is about contingency. And therefore, I can't be a control freak. So now I really like the title, Ça dépend. I think it's better. So thank you for that, for not giving way, Pierre, and thank you to, I don't know if Philippe, who designed it beautifully, is here, but thank you to Philippe and also to Jean-Francois and to the Edition Villette for getting it where it is. So this evening, I'm going to do the whole book in an hour, but I'm going to just 10 little bits of it, okay? And at the end, I won't tell you the whole thing, so then you have to buy it, yeah? And I don't get any royalties, so that's not, it's not for me to be a salesman, apart from on behalf of Edition. So this is the book in 30 seconds. Architecture depends on all these things. It doesn't exist in isolation, that all these different external forces and materials and politics shape architecture. But the trouble is that all these external forces are so frightening to the autonomy of architecture that architecture holds up the holy cross of architecture with a capital A to try to banish these external contingencies. The trouble is that they will come back to haunt and disturb the perfect body of architecture. So get used to it. That's the book. Okay, thank you. Just while those are up there, I think also just those words, which I probably mistranslated, I apologize. Well, I didn't, Google. also show why architecture education is so incredible, because you have to negotiate and circumnavigate all these different places of intellectual, material, and political thought. And because of that, I think architecture education prepares you for a life maybe of architecture, but if it's not of architecture, it prepares you for a very rich life. So these dependencies are always going to be there, and I could have put another 100 up there, yeah. So let me read the book. A bad translation. We get out on the 14th floor. This rarely is there. It is in Sheffield, the entry to another school of architecture. This school occupies the top 6 floors of the highest tower in the city. At the time of its completion in 1966, the tower was the tallest academic building in Europe. Its 19-story height, determined not by the architects, who had initially designed only 13 stories, but by the university clients in their desire to create a significant landmark. That's architecture's dependency for you. The building is known as the Arts Tower because the rest of it is occupied by bits of the Faculty of Arts. There's a nice conceit here, architecture crowning the building, literally and symbolically, signaling itself as mother of the arts. But there's a problem here as well, because the ascendancy also signals literal and symbolic detachment. We look down at the city below, and at this distance, command it as an abstraction. The voices of people are lost. We just observe their functions. Buildings are reduced to form, roads to flows of traffic. Noises are measured, not listened to. Shapes are classified by type, not sensuously enjoyed. One's body is no longer classed by the streets, as Michel de Certeau says, standing prophetically on top of the New York World Trade Center, nor is it possessed by the rumble of so many differences. And from below, the city looks back and sees us as remote figures of authority. So the opening chapter of the book talks about the way that architecture school in particular sets you up to be different. It takes you away from the city to some extent and takes you into what Rainer Banham calls the tribal longhouse. You as students are introduced to a whole set of rituals, of routines, of strange behaviors. It has to be said, you're actually quite good as an audience because you're not all wearing black. So maybe you haven't yet been fully incarcerated in the discipline of architecture. But if you think about your first review, where you stand up in front of your work and you're really tired and you've been up all night and you think, why is that necessary? But at the same time, you kind of quite enjoy it. You quite enjoy the pain and the difference of being an architecture student. And in this moment of the school, I argue that a whole set of strange codes and conducts are introduced into the discipline of architecture, which makes it different and makes you different. Students enter as normal, situated humans and come out as rather abnormal, detached members of the tribe. This kind of social autonomy, for all its gauchiness and moments of absurdity, is understandable. Tribes stick together. What is less comprehensible and defensible is when the social autonomy of the profession slips boundaries and manifests itself as the autonomy of practice, or stranger still, the autonomy of practice's products, namely buildings. How could practice, with all its engagements with others, ever be considered as an independent activity? How could buildings, with all their occupation by others, ever be torn from their social context? So, one of the criticisms of the book has been that I, in a way, make a comedy of architecture, that in a way I exaggerate the behaviors and the codes and the stupidity sometimes of architectural behavior. And I'm somewhat guilty of that. But then I go to an architecture lecture by someone dressed in black who's talking about their buildings when there are no people in them and talking about it in purely formal or aesthetic or genealogical terms. And I think, no, I didn't go far enough. I don't think I actually stuck the knife in hard enough. And so maybe that's why 20 years on, the book is still kind of in people's minds. And I end the book with this quote from the Brazilian artist Otichicha: "Purity is a myth. We cannot exist in a state of believing that architecture is a pure, detached discipline. We have to see it as something which is always engaged, always contingent, and always dependent." The second chapter is about order, and it starts with a quote from a very famous, but I think a rather dull writer called Vitruvius. He's famous because he wrote the first book of architecture, and therefore we're still meant to believe it 2,000 years on, that within the European tradition, it all starts in Rome, it starts in Greece, and then we go to Rome, and Vitruvius writes a book, and he's still quoted. And actually, a lot of the book is pretty dumb. It's also quite dangerous, I think, some of the book. I decided to bring the whole body of this great discipline to complete order. So he's not a modest man. Architecture depends on order. My reading of order then, and the relationship of order to architecture in the book, is very dependent on Zygmunt Bauman, who is a Polish sociologist who then moved to England. And he writes brilliantly about modernity in terms of order. Of all the impossible tasks that modernity set itself, the task of order, more precisely and most importantly, of order as task, stands out. The typical modern practice is the effort to exterminate ambivalence. The law of rippling is the elimination of the equivocal. So one can see in the 20th century, and potentially still now, the idea that architecture is in some way an ordering device. I kind of understand it when that ordering is related to aesthetics, so that we get neat facades and windows lining up, and then when that's too much, we get colour and postmodernism, but that's still, in its own way, an ordering. More dangerously is when that aesthetic ordering is translated into a form of social ordering. And this chapter has a lot of examples. I do use Corbusier quite a lot, I'm afraid, but he's Swiss, not French, so that's okay. That Corbusier and many others talk about the ordering tendency of architecture as a form of social ordering. And of course, architecture has been used and is continued to be used as a form of political power. And so this sense that architecture is always associated with forms of order is something that we have to be quite critical of. And what I then talk about is how this modern way of seeing the world, of eliminating the equivocal, of eliminating ambivalence, of ordering the world, is also a way by which the world has been got rid of contingency. And I do a bit here where I take this famous book by Edmund Bacon, The Order of Cities, and I look at this and I think, okay, here we have Piranesi, right? And he's drawing in the Vedute di Roma this scene of time and weather and dirt and a road that's going like that, and you can almost smell it, the horses going down the road and the lovers kissing on the step. So you can feel the life of the city. But this is much too much. We need to get rid of this and instead cleanse the city down to a set of devices that we are in control of. We can draw straight roads, we can colour them, we can draw piazzas. Those bits of what we do, that's how we feel we are in control of the world. But as in my first slide with all the words, the issue is that life of the city will come back to disturb the order of the streets. And in philosophy from Aristotle onwards, there has been this kind of sense that if we live in a modern world determined and overseen by reason, then we have to get rid of these dependencies, of these other things, of these contingencies. And therefore there's been, through the history of philosophy, there has also been this sense that we need to order the mind into a rational, reasoned way of thinking about the world. And if you're reading the book, and here we have the famous pictures from Pesach and Boudon. If you're reading the book, by the way, the next chapter is too difficult. I don't know if it was edited. I hope it may have been edited. I think it was because it was my first sole-authored book, and I was very sort of. It's like doing a PhD. You're always looking over your shoulder. Yeah, you're always worried about the critic. And I just finished a degree in philosophy, so I was full of philosophy, and it's got too many footnotes and it's too difficult. But just to the book, this chapter is about how one deals with contingency, and just this is a fantastic definition of contingency. Things might be otherwise. The building that you build is not going to remain as you designed it. Get used to it. These really annoying people called users and occupants, incredibly annoying. They come in and they disturb your building, which is why the whole history of modern architecture, apart from that picture from Boudon, I think actually that may be Peter Bundle-Jones, whatever. The history of modern architecture, the history of design, which is now the history of architecture, is told through design, is a history of buildings which photographs are taken before anyone has disturbed the building. And therefore, all the buildings are presented as forms of perfection, rather than as being overcome and overwhelmed by the forces of time and the forces of people. So, blah, blah, blah. Architects are thus faced with a double bind. Not only is their own discipline intractably contingent, but also the products of that discipline, buildings, are exposed to the contingency of the world. So our discipline doesn't exist on its own. We're always dependent on other people. Mainly now we're dependent on the market, but we're also dependent on clients, on engineers, on planners, on landscape, on everything. So we are never remote. We're always part of a wider social and economic network. But then our buildings also are. Clearly, our buildings are always overcome and disturbed by other forces. So the question then is, how do we deal with, how do we accept that contingency? My argument at the beginning is that what architects tend to do is to push it away, to push that dependency to one side, because we define our profession as a stable, expert body of knowledge. And as soon as we accept that that knowledge is actually always part of a wider set of relations, then we start to lose control over it, and it feels like our profession is weakened. In fact, it's what makes the profession so absolutely brilliant when it's good, is when it absorbs and negotiates and collaborates with those other forces. Contingency asks us to make choices. If things are never what you expect them to be, you have to kind of make choices about which is the best way forward. Dealing with contingency calls for us to have a vision. So this is different from being a relativist in which anything goes. Contingency, it's okay within the contingent world to have a vision, mainly about making the world a better place to live in, but also to be modest and light-footed enough to allow that vision to be adjusted to circumstances. So that vision is never a vision of perfection. It's always a vision which allows itself to be adjusted. And from this, I draw on the work of the American feminist thinker, philosopher, writer, Donna Haraway, and her idea of situated knowledge, in which she says we might become answerable. We take responsibility for our enabling practices. We see opportunities in the particular, so that's important, rather than just landing a universal form of dogma, of ideology onto the world. We always deal from the ground upwards, from the particular. And that is not always the case. If you think of the famous architects at the moment, if you think of Zaha Hadid, there is a certain method of dealing with the world. There will be a story that an opera house is meant to look like a wave or something quite banal, but it will still end up as a parametric building, because that is the universal parametric approach and ideology that Zaha and then Patrick Schumacher have been using. It doesn't work from the context of the particular. sometimes does this. It's just too much. Okay, so that was the first part. Okay, I'm good. It's okay. 20 minutes. Yep, good. Yep. Okay. Now this is, I don't know how this translates. Can you read it out? Because it's important. No, because I think it says... So this was, I went to a lecture in Sheffield from an engineer, and he was trying to taunt, to kind of upset the architects in the audience. And this is what he said. That's what we're doing. We're just getting a piece of waste and we're putting it comes up into the world, it's formed, goes down and becomes waste, déchet. That's a terrifying thing to say to an architect, because it goes against all the things that I'm going to talk about, that architecture is timeless, that it's stable, that it exists beyond time. So I only introduce, in this chapter is called The Time of Waste, to introduce the idea of, and I talk about rubbish theory of waste, of déchet, exposes architecture to two fears, time and dependency. I introduce waste to architecture in order to bring time into architecture. So now I want to talk about time. In one photograph, a fish lies on a table in a modernist room. In another, the fish has been replaced with a loaf of bread. The photographs have been reproduced time and time again, multiplying the loaves and fishes and embedding them into the creed of architectural modernism. But this is not the only miracle that Le Corbusier achieves in these seminal photographs of the Villas Stein and Concevoir. The real triumph of these tableaux is to abolish time within architecture. You know the scene isn't real, because there's a jug of milk and a teapot on the table, as well as a fish. And who drinks tea with fish in France? Le Corbusier's photographs are consciously manipulated to banish normal domestic inhabitation. They are indeed still lives. So this chapter is called Out of Time and describes the way that architects attempt, as Bataille notes, the presumed essence of architecture is the cancelling of time. We attempt to get rid of time. That's quite a difficult thing to do, but as I tried to explain before, the history of architecture is too often told as a set of instants, of moments, of frozen time, and not as a continuity. And one of the Gropius would thus describe Mies as relentlessly distilling the permanent from the transitory, resolutely discarding anything superfluous, but it's the distilling the permanent from the transitory. And one of the things, someone, if you want a PhD for me, you should do a PhD about the use of the word timeless in architectural criticism. And I think there's a direct correlation between the applause of timeless and how great an architect is. So in particular, someone like Zumthor, Peter Zumthor, every single article you read about Zumthor, it's timeless architecture. So there are various techniques by which architecture is meant to lift itself above time, to be timeless. to express eternity. And you see pictures like the Japanese garden, or you see pictures of Zumthor, and you can begin to believe that is true. And so there's a thing about it being timeless, but there's also the thing about it somehow expressing the spirit of the age, which is what Gideon talks about within modernity. Whatever happened? Does anyone know whatever happened to this group of Parisian architects? They're called Le Quai. I don't know who they are, except, well, I did, because I wrote to them to get this image. And one of the things is that it's very, very difficult to draw time. Therefore, most architectural drawings, and particularly in architecture school, don't have time in them. They actually, because of the way the computer fakes time by kind of doing CGIs and they have weather in it and might have a few people, but actually it's a very fake form of time. And there's a nice quote by Laurie Anderson, which I think is still true, which she says, "I won't believe in virtual reality until they learn how to put dirt into it." And I think that there is some truth in that a lot of architectural drawings are outside of time, partly because it's so difficult to draw time. And that's why I found these drawings by Le Quai Architecture quite poignant, because they try to include within their work the passage of time. And what this also does is, if you lift architecture out of time, is it reinforces architecture's autonomy and distance. It's a mode by which architecture kind of shields itself from its contingency, from its dependencies. Keep off time. Time is untouchable. One must not provoke it. Isn't it enough for you just to have space? Space is for human beings. You can swing about in space, turn somersaults, fall down, jump from star to star. For goodness sake, don't tamper with time, says Bruno Schulz. It's an impossible thing to do, to actually think that you are timeless, to think that architecture exists above the forces of time. So this section then begins to introduce time back into the argument by talking about the idea of the unfinished. Again, this is a problematic approach to take within architecture, because by accepting the unfinished, you are also accepting that you will lose control. That in some way, that if I design a building as purposely unfinished, as some architects have done, such as Herzberger and a few others, then you are accepting that you are not fully in control. But my argument is that that is an honest acceptance. And so this bit talks about the unfinished. I missed a bit, which is a fantastic quote. Maybe it comes later. I think it comes later. Okay, let's keep going then. So the next chapter, that was called Out of Time. The next chapter is called In Time, and it starts with a little discussion between two great French thinkers, in which Bruno Latour is playing the kind of the innocent, and explains and it talks about time. And in French, I think the word le temps is interesting because it's also the weather. And therefore the idea of time being like weather is a really strong analogy, because weather is both long-term. Well, climate change is not that long-term actually, but it is long-term. It happens over a cycle of a year. It happens in a shorter term through seasons. It happens in the instant of the rain coming down. So the weather as a form of time is multiple. And that is something also which I think is very interesting as a mode of thinking about architecture, to think about these multiple times, to think about what I talk about is a notion of what I call thick time, that we don't exist as a series of perfected instants, which is how the history of architecture too often is told, but we exist in a kind of continuum, and in the moment of thick time, we are experiencing the present, but we're also drawing on the past in order to project into the future. So this type of time is very different from most descriptions of time, which have been happening within this idea of successive instants of history. And so thick time it's this bit about how you get into time. And there's this fantastic story, which I will tell you because I love it so much. When I was writing the book, and if you still actually pick up books, it's very nice to have a book to pick up. The first thing I go to is the index, or the contents page. And I look at those and I think, ooh, that's interesting. And I was writing about James Joyce. And I was writing about Ulysses. And I was writing about how Ulysses has all these multiple types of time within it, from the historical time of the colonialism of English over Ireland to the instant of reading a newspaper. And so I was reading the book about James Joyce, his biography, and I looked into the index and I saw Siegfried Gideon. Now, Siegfried Gideon is the great historian of modernity, of the modern movement. Siegfried Gideon is sort of looking over my shoulder and doesn't like the book at all. And Siegfried Gideon, for James Joyce's last ever Christmas before he died, he spends it with Siegfried Gideon in their villa in Switzerland. And Gideon has just taken Joyce to see some nice white buildings. I think they're by Breuer, but I can't quite find out who they're by. And they go back to Gideon's, actually it's a farmhouse, not a villa, a farmhouse, and they're sitting in front of the fire, and Gideon is saying, aren't those buildings fabulous? And James Joyce just says, you don't know how wonderful dirt is. And I just think that's, for me, that also, I could summarize the whole book just through that. Of course, he doesn't really mean dirt as, just that. He means dirt as a symbol of life, a symbol of passing time, a symbol of people disturbing the world. And so that kind of sense that the whiteness of Gideon versus the dirtiness of Joyce is also a story about time. Blah, blah, blah. I then talk about Herxberg there a bit. I talk about the difficulty of drawing time, which I've already talked about. And this kind of little anecdote about Koolhaas, Rem Koolhaas, before he went over to the dark side. Rem Koolhaas, there was an exhibition of sketches of architects, right? And of course, all famous architects. and the exhibition was full of sketches on napkins from either first-class aeroplanes or expensive Parisian restaurants, yeah? Just to show that we are rich and bourgeois at the same time, we live a good life, we can fly first class. And it was kind of classic. Rem did this wonderful thing. He said, I don't want a napkin, I want a tablecloth. Because what he's pointing out is the impossibility to represent architecture in those kind of sketches, which you do a little sketch and that's meant to summarize the whole building. And Rem is saying, no, architecture actually, you need a whole tablecloth so you can draw the richness of the whole building. So, my argument is not with the virtuosity of the drawing or with the sketch per se, but with the notion that these internalized codes, and let's face it, architectural representation is very internalized as a way of describing the world. Even CGIs, I would argue, can represent the fullness of architecture at the expense of other means of spatial communication. So why do we rely so much on drawings? Why don't we describe the city as a set of stories? Stories of the past, of the present, but importantly, stories of what we want the city to be in the future. Because stories have people in them. Stories have space in them. Stories have time in them. Stories have emotion in them. Stories have all these difficulties of interrelational forces, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't that be a much better way of starting an architecture project than sitting down and doing a sketch on a napkin in an aeroplane? So it's a bit about storytelling. The next chapter is called Slack Space, and it's a critique of the way that architects describe space. Architecture is the thoughtful making of spaces. We separate, limit, and bring into human scale a part of unlimited space. I am space, says Theo van Doesburg, and so on and so forth. So all of these ideas is that in some way what we do as architects, and it happens in architecture school, I'm afraid, is that somehow we turn a handle and space comes out like in a sausage machine. And then we talk about negative space and positive space, public space and semi-public space and private space, and we codify space into little packages of space. They're empty. They don't actually often have life in them. Even as soon as it's codified as public space, the public are excluded and taken into the world of the architect. These drawings, I could go on. I could write a book just about this drawing. This comes from a government handbook on how to design housing. And what I love about this drawing is how gendered it is. So it's meant to be very, very rational, authoritative. It's measured very carefully, 600, blah, blah, blah. But then the two women are sitting on the sofa gossiping, and the men have a glass of beer and watching television. And so the description of it as a gendered situation is much more powerful than the description of it as a set of numbers, but it's given to you as a set of numbers. And it's what Tatiana and I call, in flexible housing, call hard space. And what we're looking for is soft space. Space which is not fully determined, space which has a softness to it, not a material softness, by the way, but a kind of social softness to it, in which other activities can happen. The other trouble with the notion of hard space and measured space is if you can measure it, you can also sell it. So measured space becomes very quickly commodified and so becomes part of the market. And there's a bit in the book which is uncomfortable, but actually is now much too soft, which basically says that architecture is a velvet glove around the hard fist of capital. That all the architects, this is really depressing. There's some great architects in France, and I want you to be one of them. But I would talk about English architects in Saudi Arabia, right? Who are dressing up the hard fist of capital in nice clothes in order to make it look acceptable. And too much architecture is basically providing a veneer of respectability for the rampant forces of late capital. That's a much longer argument, and much, much more apparent than when I wrote the book. Whether they like it or not, they, architects, are in the thick of political space. Architecture is political, full stop. Not political in the party political sense of the term, but political in the original sense of the word, in that it affects the lives of citizens. It is not enough architects to deny the political consequences of their actions by retreating to the high ground of the neutrality of abstract space. So when I left Central St. Martin's, I felt that I could kind of break free from, it was quite a big job running of one of the world's great art schools, and I had some institutional responsibilities. I now have a Substack where I can write exactly what I want. So I wrote a very critical piece, for example, about Saudi, talking about the way that architects completely divorce themselves, deny the political context of what it means to work within an autocratic, homophobic, climate-destroying, I could go on, labor-exploiting regime. And they don't talk about that. They talk about, well, if I do a beautiful building, maybe it will make a difference. It won't. So here we go. Here we have Lefebvre. And just this really, really direct, and I talk about the way that he uses the brackets, because I really like the brackets in this. I explain it in that bit there about why the brackets are important. But as soon as Lefebvre says that, then we can no longer feel that what we do as architects is divorced from social and political life. And that's why I think that, although I admit I have never read the production of Space from cover to cover, mainly because it's really, really badly written. Am I allowed to say that? It is. It's really difficult. But it's so important as a book because of just the central argument that social space is a social product. So there's a bit about not being a phenomenologist, but I won't do that. I put that in because I was taught by some phenomenologists, and they really annoyed me because, of course, architecture is associated with the body. Of course we experience architecture through our senses. Of course the phenomenology of the world is also an architectural phenomenology. Of course, straightforward. But as soon as then you start basically reading Heidegger and talking about authenticity, then that all goes out of the window for me. But anyway, we won't go into that because you don't have to read it. So then I get on to a bit called lo-fi architecture. And I've got another, I said I'd be an hour. I think we started about 1:45, so I've got 15 minutes, if that's okay. It's a beautiful story, this. When I was a student, I, like you, stayed up all night. It's so stupid, but we all do it. We feel that unless we do it, we're not a proper student. We know that after 10 o'clock we're working at about fifth capacity, but we know all this, but we still do it. Anyway, so I was up all night, and I was listening to the radio, and Elvis Costello came on at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, it wasn't live. And he just says this beautiful thing, which is, the last thing I do before releasing a record is to get the engineers to play it through a cheap radio. Because that is how it's going to be heard by most people. In a state of distraction, in a state of low fidelity. And then I follow up this story with a Corbusier story. Sorry, Corb. In which he says he can't bear going to a concert hall because it's full of other people, and they cough and they smell and they make noises, and he can't wait to get back to his hi-fi. So I make the analogy that architecture is normally described as a hi-fi discipline, high fidelity, expensive, perfect discipline, whereas in fact I think it's a lo-fi. It's a low-fidelity discipline. It's seen in a state of distraction, but also it's seen as part of the everyday. Very few buildings aren't part of the everyday. The ones, unfortunately, that are most talked about are lifted out of the everyday. Museums, churches, don't form part of everyday life. You go to a museum as a special part of your life. You go to a church as a special part of your life. And the history of architecture is dominated by those kinds of buildings, which then take away the idea that architecture is essentially part of the everyday. And so this sense that of lo-fi architecture is what I come up with. Blah, 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 blah. I got criticized for putting my own building in. Anyway, that's another thing. Lo-fi architecture is much more than an aesthetic issue alone, but brings in the social and ethical. Its production is collective. We don't work on our own, and thus depend on far more than the guiding hand of a single architect. Lo-fi architecture, thirdly, is intentionally hybrid. It transgresses conventional boundaries. Lo-fi architecture is always alert to the context, physical and social. I just put that in, I just think it's a really good subheading. How they tell if your building is gay. Now I've put that up, you're going to have to buy the book to find out why they said that. But it is interesting. So I put in very, very quickly the names of some architects. Yeah, it was a huge mistake because as soon as I put those names in, everyone says, "Oh, Jeremy likes the dirty stuff. Oh, Jeremy likes the girly stuff. Oh, Jeremy likes the kind of because it suddenly aestheticizes the argument." So I think it was a mistake to put those in, and they also now look quite dated. But anyway, I did, so I admit to my mistake. Okay, architectural agency. I'm going to go quite quickly through this because I want to talk more about ethics to end up with. Zygmunt Bauman states, "Expertise creates and enhances the need of itself." Expertise creates and enhances the need of itself. Architectural expertise is part of that, in as much as we define ourselves, supposedly, through our expertise. I'm going to go quite quickly through this bit and get to the problem of the problem. We're on number 9, okay? So just pace. It's important to know where you are in a lecture. I always worry about that, particularly on these when when you don't know if the person's got 300 slides, and you think, oh God. At least when there was carousels. Do you know what a carousel is, children? No, you don't. Carousels were physical things, and at least when there were carousels with slides in, physical things, yeah, you could see the architect would bring along a carousel, and you'd think, oh my God, it's a 3-carousel lecture, and you could kind of pace yourself. Whereas now, you can't do that, so that you're kind of you're at the mercy. So I think it's important. You're number 9 of 10. I've got a coda as well, so 2 more. Okay. The problem of the problem. This is particularly apparent now. The world is seen as a set of problems. One of them is called climate breakdown. We, as experts, look at the world as a set of problems, and we bring our expertise to solve those problems. And we feel good about that. So we design sustainable buildings. I'm not saying don't design sustainable buildings which are truly carbon positive or carbon neutral. I'm not saying that. But you are not solving climate breakdown by that. But our whole discipline is founded on the idea since the 19th century that what we are doing is solving problems of the world. But what that does is to detach us from the world as remote figures of expertise, as I write about right in that first bit I quoted. So there's a problem with the problem. A professional, says Rainer Banham, is a man with an interest, a continuing interest in the existence of problems. If we didn't have problems to solve, we wouldn't be professional anymore, is what he's saying. But what we're saying, particularly in my most recent piece of work, which I'm going to talk about more in Brussels, is that actually that is so what we call band-aiding. It makes us feel good that we're doing a building which has trees on. Oh, no, don't talk about buildings with trees on. But you know what I mean, that we are doing so-called green buildings. It makes us feel good, but it is so partial. It is such a tiny approach, because what it's not dealing with is the causes of climate breakdown, and in particular the causes of late capitalism. So instead, what I write about, I can't go back, that's a pity, is sense-making. There's a nice quote. You have to read the book. Buy the book, read it. Instead of solving problems, we make sense. We make sense of the world and then try to intervene in it in a responsible manner. The chapter on ethics is really, I read it the other day, and it's really angry. I think it may be because my publisher was pushing me that, where's the bloody book, Jeremy? And I was a typical author saying, no, it's coming. And I felt, okay, I've got to get this down quickly. But there is something about architects and morals and ethics in which architects, and there's a whole set of quotes on this side of the page, God lies in the details. Yeah? If we do a good detail, God is going to be within it. I'm glad you laughed, because it's ridiculous. And there's a whole set of other quotes from famous people, much more serious than I am, in which what it does is to associate the rightness of aesthetics, the perfection of aesthetics, with the perfection of morals. If we design in an aesthetically right manner, we are somehow fulfilling our ethical duty. And this is what I call phony ethics. That somehow ethics in architecture is too often associated with aesthetics, to the extent that in one Biennale they had to say less aesthetics, more ethics, and then they just did another Biennale full of pictures of buildings. So that didn't really work. But this sense that of phony ethics. And what's interesting about this is no architect, I think we're quite interesting as a discipline, no architect sets out to make the world a better place, a worse place. No one is intentionally trying to make the world worse as an architect. We all believe we're going to make it better. And that, you might say, is an ethical position. The trouble, as I write, is that their priority as to what constitutes the good is so misplaced. By defining the good through the codes and practices of the autonomous discipline, of timelessness, of aesthetic order, of style, and so on and so forth, you're not in any way addressing the morality and ethics of the real world. A brick has no morals. There is no redemption in shadow gaps. Blobs do not possess, as Greg Lynn once said, an ethics of motion. They are blobs. Then there's a bit called Codes of Misconduct, which is that people believe that because there are codes of practice, and I don't know how it works in France, but there will be within your institute or within your professional body a code of conduct. In the UK, that code of conduct is described as providing a source of ethical guidance. You then look at the code of conduct, and I've just written about it on my Substack, and basically the code of conduct is don't piss off the client. That's basically it. So there's nothing ethical about that at all. I don't know where it is, but it is. Okay, I'm going to move on. So again, Bauman comes back. And this again is just such a beautiful description. To assume an ethical stance means to assume the responsibility for the other. And the other is multiple. The other is more than human. The other is planetary. The other is other people. The other is people who are ground down, and so on and so forth. That is what ethics are. And I just did a lecture to first-year students. I called it Architecture 101, and that was every line you draw has a consequence. The trouble is most lines, particularly in architecture school, are used as a means of describing the potential of a building. Whereas in fact, every line is describing a social condition, a social relationship. The line of this, someone drew that height, makes me feel good, because I am in power of you, and you all look at me adoringly, because I am above you and I'm in a position of power. So that line was very determined about a social relationship. So my Architecture 101 is every line you draw has a consequence, and that consequence is mainly a social consequence. And then you remember Bauman, and you're going to be a much nicer person. Right, I want to get past this bit. There's quite a nice quote by somebody. So this is the last chapter, Hope Against Hope. So having been angry, having flattened a lot of architectural culture, having made myself quite unpopular, it's what I think in the book it says, also in the epilogue, it says, it's what in Britain we call a Marmite book, yeah? Marmite is that black stuff that you put on toast, yeah? And you either love it or you hate it, and nothing in between. And this book is a Marmite book that some people love it. If I go to some schools of architecture in Scandinavia or even in some bits of the States, I'm welcomed like a returning hero. In other schools of architecture, I happen to know that it was actually more or less banned because it was seen as too disruptive. So it is a Marmite book, But also, I hope, and that's why this last bit is called Hope Against Hope, is that towards the end, having dismantled some of the holy cows, some of the sacred moments of architecture, to try to reconstruct them from the bottom up. And the final figure that I talk about, and it is, the action of the architecture here is not about the implementation of generic solutions to particular problems. I talked about that. It is not about the architect as the detached polisher of form and technique, but as the person who gathers the conflicting voices of a given situation and makes the best possible social and spatial sense of them. Hope is not discovered in the clouds of ideals that are blown away by the slightest breeze. Hope is founded in the interstices of the given. And since it has a tough start in life, this hope is a survivor. Such hope has to be first established in the reconfiguration of the social, not in the false hopes of form and technique. If one accepts that social relationships are embedded in spatial relationships, then the architect has an important role to play in this reconfiguration, as long as the tenets of transformative vocation are followed, work out from the given context, be both practical and imaginative, critical and visionary. So I absolutely, and it would be a terrible thing that having run schools of architecture, run an art school, if I said the whole discipline is corrupt and impotent. I absolutely believe, and particularly in relation to climate breakdown, that climate breakdown requires systemic change, not a nice building made out of straw bales. Do that if you need to. It needs systemic change. And that systemic change will be accompanied by change, radical change, if we are going to survive on this planet, in our social relationships, social, economic, political relationships. And if you follow Lefebvre, then those social relationships, those reinvented social relationships, will be accompanied by reinvented spatial relationships. And that is where architects, if they break free from the bounds of the history of architecture and find new ways of thinking about the world, still have an incredibly important role to play. And the figure that I end up with is the figure of angels with dirty faces. Angels with dirty faces, angels able to pass through space, time, and walls with dirty faces, and then able to bring them all together. Angels, androgynous imaginers of possibility, with dirty faces, which is always engaged. Angels, the original messengers, with dirty faces, human and slightly flawed. Architects modestly bound to the earth, but with the vision, environmental sense, and ethical imagination to protect new social, spatial futures on behalf of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Till, for this wonderful voyage through the book and a very stimulating lecture. So maybe we have some energy to get some questions from the public.
So, hello, thank you very much for your lecture, Jeremy. And I would like to ask you about the fact that your book is not timeless. You are not going to argue with that. And you say you write it 20 years ago. And I think when we read it around 2010, it was really, the argument was really strong, and I think the autonomy really took a hit. But we are 15 years later. So don't you think that 15 years later, the situation is exactly the same or not? And I'm wondering myself today that sometimes it's nice also to think against yourself, and that maybe it's also time to go after heteronomy. And I don't know, but about these 15 years, and now with the French edition, do you think we are exactly in the same situation than we were 20 years ago?
Thank you. I think that's is a really important question for me. And the answer is yes and no. We are in exactly the same position in the way that architecture is currently discussed within the mainstream press, within the professional bodies, and I'm afraid still within some schools of architecture. So I don't think that there's very much changed at the top level of architectural codification and the profession. We still hand out awards to buildings which are manifestly full of concrete and just to do with aesthetics. We still codify the way that students are taught in the UK through professional criteria. The profession holds on to its power in order that it can find new markets. So at that level, I think much of it is still there. But the no level is that there is, without any doubt, a grassroots antipathy and discomfort with that description of architecture, coming from the next generation, coming from architects of different genders, i.e. not men, architects of different races, i.e. not white, of students who are getting increasingly frustrated about the mythology that they're being sold, and by an understanding of architectural practice working in an expanded field. And I think that aspect of architecture gives me hope, but it's still, I'm afraid, very much dominated by a discourse around the professional body. I don't know if you agree or not.
I'll try in English. Thank you for your presentation. Hearing you, I was wondering if the writings of Charles Jencks was for you a source of inspiration when he denunciates high modernism, boring platonism, etc. And when he conceptualized what he calls adocism regarding your positions of contingency.
Yes, inevitably. Charles, at a very personal level, was a huge supporter of my partner Sarah Wigglesworth, and that meant a lot. Charles had a brilliant, expanded way of seeing the world, and as you were saying, taking on some of those things. But I think that the thing that he's most famous for, which is the exhibition in Brussels looks at, not most famous, but it's kind of summarized, is in those diagrams. And the diagrams of a kind of architectural genealogy, they do show shifts from some of the modernist orthodoxies into, I mean, he more or less invented postmodern architecture through those books, into different ways of doing architecture. But because they're seen as part of a genealogy, too often those diagrams are read as stylistic succession as opposed to a kind of conceptual succession. So I think that those diagrams of
they're brilliant. I think that, you know, and I've seen of white men still doing architecture with a capital A. I don't think he completely breaks. And I think part of what they're doing in this new round of chronograms, which is on show in Brussels, is actually saying, what are the other ways by doing diagrams of architecture? And that's where the one that we came up with about climate comes in.
But what about adokism? Is it for you a kind of anomaly in the James bibliography? Or because he speaks about other way of doing architecture, bricolage, and composite objects, which are useful in the instant for people, etc.
All of that is true, but the danger is that because it's still within a diagram and still within the Jenkins canon, it can then be read as a form of aesthetics rather than as an alternative way of thinking, and therefore gets appropriated back into the canon as a slightly kind of difficult moment of the canon, as opposed to releasing itself from the aesthetic hold of the canon, releasing and actually seen as a really genuine grassroots alternative way of doing architecture.
You had, you had hinted before the lecture that you were looking for an opportunity to talk a bit more about climate and what you were going to be presenting in Brussels. So I'm wondering if it's actually possible to look at the chronogram and maybe kind of compare that in terms of terraforming and kind of opening up a little bit more on climate.
So if the very simple, not simple, the very direct argument that we're making within this chronogram this one, is that too often within architecture as a problem solving, which I hinted at, that what we're doing is dealing with a problem here and now, and we're doing what we can, which is good. I absolutely want you to do buildings which are low carbon, etc., etc. But that might actually be perpetuating the problem, just kind of making us live in a sense that it's all going to be okay if we build in hemp and straw. It isn't, because what that doesn't do is to look at the causes. And so our argument in this project is that we have to first look upstream at the causes of climate breakdown, and these are listed here: violating, band-aiding, exploiting, accumulating, separating, and ignoring. And so if you go onto the website Architecture's Climate, it has all of those, and then on the top we've got what we call the sites of climate breakdown, and that forms a matrix in which we are implying quite strongly that architecture is complicit in climate breakdown. Architecture is part of the production of climate breakdown. And therefore the only way that we can escape that, but not escape it, but make sense of it, is to look at these causes and at these words and at what is going on, and then deal with those as the causal effects of climate breakdown. But it does demand other ways of doing architecture. I mean, I make exactly the same argument that, well, I made it already. Climate breakdown is systemic, social relations, new social relations, new spatial relations. Lots of scope of new ways of spatial thinking in which architects could be involved in.
Good evening. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, I know you said that putting architects' names in the book is aestheticizing the argument, and I find it really interesting, and it's I still maybe want to ask you, when you're talking about other ways of making architecture today, so the book was written 10, 15 years ago, are you maybe able to talk about other ways of making architecture and maybe naming, maybe it's not architects that are doing architecture, but maybe other disciplines, other agents.
So again, to publicise our next book, which is done with a research collective called Mold, there's a big website, which I'm really proud of. I think it's got a lot of stuff in there called Architecture as Climate. The first bit of that is all the miserable stuff, all this. The last bit is about futures, so that's a bit more hopeful. The main bit is 120 practices. Yeah. We do say these are practices not as you normally know them. There are no pictures of buildings in there at all, but we do name some architects in there. So, for example, we would name Assemble not for their building, but for a project they did in Liverpool, where they did an amazing piece of community building. We name Lacaton because of what they do, and they don't tear buildings down, but they reinvent them. We name some others, but mainly we're naming artists and politics. So it's got things like the Chilean constitution is in there. It's got lots and lots of different examples of how we think people are dealing with climate breakdown through various forms of practices and various interdisciplinary ways of thinking. But not that many architects are named in there. And we may know the project was called Architecture After Architecture. Basically, it was arguing it's a kind of natural succession to this book. It's arguing that climate breakdown makes all the basis on which the modern project was founded and which architecture is founded, it makes all of those impossible. You can no longer have growth, you can no longer have endless progress, you can no longer have pure order, you can no longer separate yourself from nature. All of those things are what architecture, as we know it, have done. Therefore, what is architecture after architecture? Therefore, we're not going to find the solution to that in current forms of practice. We have to look, but if you look at the diagram, there's lots of gaps. And what we need to do is open up those gaps. And there are words in the gaps which are a bit more hopeful. And that's what that project does.
I have a question about this other ways of doing architecture. There is a word in your book that is still survive after the book, after this deconstruction of all the founding elements of our culture, is the word project. The project still exists after your books, after this book. And do you think this word is still valid to describe architectural agency today? Or is it a word that could be questioned?
The trouble is, project means very different things in French, English, and particularly Italian. And so the Italian version is very different from the English version. And I think the trouble with the word project in English, and I don't know enough about how it's received in France, is that it's, les grands projets, there you go. Yeah? That the big projects are in some way going to rescue France and Paris from from its historical dirt. And the kind of sense, therefore, that a project, that architecture is still invested in the idea of the project rather than the process. I like the word practice much better. The practice of spatial agency, the practice of architecture, because I like the word practice because it's not fully formed. We're still practicing, yeah? We're still kind of inventing, we're practicing, it's not perfect. So, but the project still has a sense of authority to it, which I'm not sure is something that we should be claiming at the moment when the world is falling down around us. You're very patient, you're all staying. I'm about to fall over. But I'll keep going for a few more questions.
I'll try to make myself clear because I'm still thinking about my question. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the first slide with all the words you put, so all the different contingencies. And I have the feeling that some of them are, let's say, more famous than others, and we are more easy to speak about them, let's say climate change, and we architects now want to be part of the solution and accept that they're also part of the problem. And I'm currently leading a research about economic crisis, which I feel is kind of the elephant in the room, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Yep.
But also regarding climate change, it's really a structural question.
Yep.
And I know you wrote about this also in a Criticat, and I would like, maybe it's not a question, it's yes.
I completely agree with you, and I think that on that initial slide, I was just trying to be playful, I suppose, in saying as many words, but I also in the lecture talked about the hold of capital over the architectural production at the moment. And in Mould's book, Architecture's Climate, there's a chapter on economy, which effectively says, unless we address the exploitations, extractivisms, extractions, and inequities of global capitalism, the planet won't survive. So, and that means looking at new economic models. It's an urgent and desperate thing that we need to do. And of course, every single political indicator at the moment is going in the other direction. That even the idea of the left, has been left behind. So that a kind of a serious evaluation of new economic models is almost impossible to talk about without being laughed at. But it's not funny. It really isn't funny. And we're seeing it being played out in terrible consequences in American politics as we speak. The return to coal I read about. He's going to open up coal mines. Yeah? That is simply to do with capital exploitation. Simply, nothing else. And so you're right, that unless we talk seriously, and I think then what becomes interesting again is new economic models bring with them new spatial models. That's where it's interesting. And there is hope, Donut economics has been taken up by the city of Amsterdam. There are other ways which we can live together without rampant exploitation and obsolescence and blah, and so on. Did that answer your question? But you're right. I think there needs to be much more written about architecture and economics.
J'ai l'impression que les questions sont de plus en plus larges, donc peut-être il est temps de conclure et de libérer Jeremy Till. Sans vouloir faire le capitaliste de service, le livre est à vendre à l'arrière de l'amphithéâtre. On est très fiers de sortir ce livre. Ça a été beaucoup de travail, ça a été 5 ans de travail, de traduction, un long travail d'édition. On espère que le livre est à la hauteur de l'original. Et voilà, vous pouvez l'acquérir si vous voulez à l'arrière de l'amphithéâtre. Et il nous reste à remercier chaleureusement Jeremy Till pour cette présentation.